Hello all. We are going to discuss about the lesson materials and things. In the last class we have discussed about the states of materials, and today we are going to see the further topic. In today's topic, actually, they have given you a situation where that was happening in a classroom in between two groups. There were actually two groups in a classroom. So the first group of people said that sugar is a liquid. First group people said sugar is a liquid. Sugar is liquid. Why they said sugar is liquid? Because if you observe the sugar is always taking the shape of the container. When I put sugar in a spoon, it is going to take the shape of the spoon. When I am going to put the sugar in a bowl, it is going to take the shape of a bowl. We all know generally liquids are going to take the shape of the container. If you pour water in a bottle, the water will take the shape of a container. Same water, if you pour it in a bowl, it will take the shape of a bowl. In the same way, they also observed that sugar is taking the shape of a container. So they concluded that sugar is a liquid. But the second group students disagreed with the first group and they said that sugar might be solid. So how to prove? How did they prove? How? Second group students proved that sugar is a solid. So they have taken each crystal of the sugar and observed. When they took each crystal of the sugar and observed, the crystal particle is very hard. It is not very hard. It is hard compared to liquids. Always liquids will be flowy in texture, but solids will not be of the same texture. So at last they observed they observed single crystal of sugar and concluded that sugar is a solid but not liquid. And coming to next, we are going to discuss about sinking or floating in water. This is one of the property of a material. All the materials will not sink and all the materials will not float. Depending upon their depending upon the type of material, some materials will be sinking in the water, some materials will be floating in the water. Sinking means going under the water, floating means just staying on the water. So if you see here, we have different things like tomato, brinjal, potato, iron nails, sponge, wood, stone, leaf, piece of chalk and paper. These are different materials which are present and we have to know which material is going to float and which material is going to sink. If you think that this is a glass of water or a bowl of water, if the material is present here, then you will be saying that the material has sunken. This is sinking, sunken. Okay. If, for example, the material is present on the water here, then you will be saying that it is floating. Okay. Now, let us assume that tomato, whether tomato is, we can predict now whether tomato will sink or will it float. Yes, tomato is going to sink. Brinjal, it is going to sink in the water. Potato is going to sink in the water. Iron nail, it is going to sink in the water. Sponge, it will float on the water. Wood, it will float on the water. Stone, it will sink in the water. Leaf, it will float on the water. Piece of chalk, it will float on the water. Paper, it will float on the water. So here we have to, you have seen that some objects are sinking in the water and some objects are floating in the water. Why do some objects sink and why do some objects float? So objects which have less weight, objects or materials which have less weight, they are going to float. They are going to float. Objects which have more weight than water, they are going to sink. Objects which have less weight than water, here water. Objects which have less weight than water, they are going to float, and objects which have more weight than water, they are going to sink. Now here I have a question. Here you can see tomato is sinking in the water, sponge is floating on the water because sponge is less weight compared to the water. And here I have a question. You all know iron nail. This is iron nail and iron tin. Iron tin. If you observe, when I put these two in the water, iron nail is going to sink, but iron tin is going to float. Though these two are made up of same material, iron, but one is sinking in the water and one is floating in the water. Why it is happening so? So, some materials in one shape will sink in water but float on water when they are in other shape. The materials that can sink can be made to float, but all the materials that float cannot be made to sink. So if you observe here, the sinking or floating of the materials will depend upon the weight of an object, as well as it is also going to depend upon the shape of an object. Just now we have seen the objects which are less in weight, they are going to float. The objects which are heavy in weight than water, it is going to sink. Not only weight, here we have to consider the shape of an object also. Iron nail is in one shape, iron tin is in one shape. So some materials in one shape will sink, some materials in other shape will float. And the materials that can sink, some materials will be sinking. That materials we can make them to float. But all the materials that float, you cannot make them to sink. If you take wood, sometimes wood they are going to float, but the same wood you can make them to sink in the water also. So this is about floating and sinking. Though it is made up of the same material, weight of the material and shape of the material is very important. We are going to see about, you can see here, this happens due to difference in shape of the object. The shape of the object is going to decide which is going to sink and which is going to float. So now we are going to see soluble and insoluble substances. All the materials are not going to be soluble and all the materials are not insoluble also. So few materials are soluble and few materials are insoluble. So what is the first meaning of soluble and insoluble? When I take a glass of water, I am going to take a glass of water and I am going to add a spoon of sugar. I am going to add a spoon of sugar to this glass of water and I'll mix it. After some time, what do you observe? Sugar will be completely dissolved in the water. Sugar will completely dissolve in the water. So what can I say? Sugar is soluble in the water. Because it is completely mixing in the water, you will be saying that sugar is soluble in the water. So the substances which the materials which dissolve completely in the water, you call them as soluble materials. The materials which does not dissolve in the water, you call them as insoluble materials. The materials which dissolve in the water, you call them as soluble materials. And the materials which does not dissolve in the water, you call them as insoluble materials. Now if you see here, they have given you few materials and they are asking you to find it out whether it is going to dissolve or not. For example, sugar. If you take sugar, yes, it is going to dissolve in the water. I think you all might have drank lemon juice and sugar syrup. In gulab jam we will be having sugar syrup, no? You Sugar will be completely mixed up in the water. Salt also completely mixed up in the water. If you observe sand, when you add sand to a glass of water, suppose instead of sugar, if I add sand to a glass of water, it will not dissolve. So no, it is not a soluble material, but it is insoluble material. Sawdust is nothing but when they are doing woodwork, the dust will be coming from that wood, so that is sawdust. When you add sawdust to the water, that also it is not soluble in the water, so it is insoluble. Chalk powder, when you mix chalk powder in the water, it is not completely dissolved in the water, but it is not completely dissolved in the water. So here you can observe, if you observe here, you have chalk powder. When chalk powder is mixed in the water, it is insoluble. It is not mixed with the water. And in the same way, when you have added, this is sawdust. When you add sawdust to the water, it is not going to mix completely in the water. So these are insoluble materials. If you have taken sugar, it will be dissolved in the water in this way. You can't absorb the sugar substances in the water. So these are soluble materials and these are insoluble materials. So here materials are going to have different properties. Based upon our convenience, we have to select the materials. If based upon your interest, what things you need, based based upon our things, we need to decide what type of material we have to use depending on our convenience. So this is about materials and things. We are going to come up with next lesson.